All right, sweet faces, welcome to week 3 homework. This week we are rounding. And the first thing that I want you to do before you get into anything is I want you to take a moment and check and underline the tens and hundreds so that as you're answering these questions, you are aware of what I'm asking you to do. It's going to help your brain focus to know exactly where we're looking at. Now, some quick reminders when we're following through the steps. Number 1, we are going to underline the place value that we are being asked to round to. We're going to circle the number to the right. Remember, that's the boss. That tells us whether we round up, increasing that underlined digit by 1, or if we roll back, if we leave it alone and zero out the rest of our numbers. Remember, no matter what, everything behind the underline always becomes a 0. So let's dive right in and take a look. We are rounding 36 to the nearest 10. That means that we are going to underline the number in the tens place. We are going to circle the number in the ones place. This number gets to be the boss. This is asking us, is 36 closer to 30 or 40? That 6 tells me to round up, which means that this 3 becomes a 4, and everything behind the underline always becomes a 0. So 36 rounded to the nearest 10 is 40. 662 rounded to the nearest 100. We're going to underline the hundreds place. We're going to circle the tens place. This tells us what to do over here. That 6 tells us that we are closer to 700. So that means that we are going to round up. Our 6 becomes a 7. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. 662 is closer to 700. Rounding 494 to the nearest 100, we underline the hundreds place. We circle the 10. That 9 is the boss. It's asking us, are we closer to 400 or 500? That 9 tells me to round up, which means my 4 gets a shove to a 5, and everything behind the underline becomes a 0. 494 is closer to 500. Rounding 59 to the nearest 10 means we underline the tens place, we circle the ones place. The 9 is the boss. We're asking ourselves, is 59 closer to 50 or 60? That 9 tells us to give our 5 a shove. Our 5 becomes a 6. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. 59 is closest to 60. Rounding 38 to the nearest 10, we're going to underline the tens place, circle the ones place. The ones place is the boss. We're asking ourselves, are we closer to 30 or 40? That 8 tells us to give our 3 a shove. The 3 becomes a 4. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. 38 is closest to 40. 492 rounded to the nearest 100. We underline the hundreds place. We circle the tens place. That is the boss. We're asking ourselves, is 492 closer to 400 or closer to 500? That 9 tells us to give our 4 a shove. The 4 becomes a 5. Everything after the underline becomes a 0. 492 is closer to 500. I'm going to ask that you stop your video here. This is the end of homework assignment number 1. All right, my loves, welcome back to your rounding homework. If you remember from last time, the first thing I asked you to do was just take a moment and underline what you're being asked to round to. This helps us focus our brain to make sure that we know what we need to look at. So, just a quick refresher of our steps. We are going to underline the place value that we are rounding to. This helps our brain make really strong connections and know where to focus. We're going to circle the number behind it. That number is the boss. That tells us whether we round up, if we give that number a shove to the next digit, or if we leave it alone. Everything behind the 0 or the underline becomes a 0. All right, my loves. 44 rounded to the nearest 10. Underline the tens place, circle the ones place. The circled number is the boss. We're asking ourselves, Am I closer to 40 or 50? That 4 tells me to roll back. I leave my 4 alone. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. 44 rolls back to 40. 877 rounded to the nearest hundred. We underline the hundredths place. We circle the tens place. The tens place is our boss. We're asking ourselves, am I closer to 800 or 900? That 7 tells me to give my 8 a shove. It becomes a 9. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. 877 is closer to 900. 142, rounded to the nearest hundred. We underline the hundredths place. We circle the tens place. The tens place is our boss. We're asking ourselves, am I closer to 100 or 200? That 4 tells me to roll back. I leave my 1 alone. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. Is 142 closer to 100 or 200? It is closer to 100. 186, rounded to the nearest 10. Be careful on this one. I was trying to trick you. We are going to underline the tens place, circle the ones place. The ones place is the boss. I'm asking myself, am I closer to 180 or 190? That circled digit tells me to give my 8 a shove. My 8 becomes a 9. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. Don't forget the 1. Remember in class we talked about sometimes if you have a brother or sister, you might have to go to their sport even though you don't play. Just like we have to bring that 1 along, right? It might not be part of the game, but it still needs to come. So 186 is closer to 190. 88 rounded to the nearest 10. Underline the tens place. Circle the ones place. Am I closer to 80 or 90? That 8 tells me to give my 8 a shove up to 9. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. It is rounded up to 90. And last but not least, 239 rounded to the nearest 100. I underline the hundredths place. I circle the tens place. That 3 tells me to roll back. I leave my 2 alone. Everything behind becomes a 0. 239 is closer to 200. That brings us to the end of our second page. Please go ahead and stop your recording now. All right, love bugs. We are on our third rounding assignment, which means at this point, you are rounding professionals. You know to underline, to figure out what you're being asked. You know that when we round, we always underline the place value we're being asked to identify and circle the number behind. That tells us what to do. 33 rounded to the nearest 10. That 3 tells us to roll back. The 3 stays the same. Everything behind the underline becomes a 0. 349 rounded to the nearest 100. Underline the hundredths place. Circle the tens place. The tens place is the boss. 349 is closer to 300. 217 rounded to the nearest 100. Underline the 2. Circle the 1. The tens place is the boss. Are we closer to 200 or 300? The 1 tells us to roll back. We are closer to 200. 129 rounded to the nearest 10. We underline the tens place, circle the ones place. The ones place is the boss. Am I closer to 120 or 130? The 9 tells me to round up. We are closer to 130. Remember to bring your 1 with you. 327 rounded to the nearest 10. Again, a tricky one. Underline the tens place, circle the ones place. The ones place is the boss. 327 is closest to 330. That 7 tells us to round up. Last one for this page. 602 rounded to the nearest hundred. Underline the hundreds place, circle the tens place. The tens place is the boss. 602 is closer to 600. Go ahead and stop your video here. That is the end of your third assignment for the week. All right, love bugs, we are on to our last assignment of the week. You have done so well. We know to identify what we're being asked. We know to look at our number. We're rounding to the nearest 10, which means I underline the tens place, I circle the ones place. The ones place is the boss. Am I closer to 40 or 50? The 2 tells me to roll back to 40. 655 rounded to the nearest hundred. Underline the hundreds place, circle the tens place. The tens place is the boss. That 5 tells me to round up. My 6 becomes a 7. Everything after the underline becomes a 0. 176 rounded to the nearest hundred. I underline the hundreds place. I circle the tens place. The tens place is the boss. That 7 tells me to round up to 200. 186 rounded to the nearest 10. Underline the tens place, circling the ones place. The ones place is the boss. 186 rounds up to 190. 37 rounded to the nearest 10. Underline the tens place, circling the ones place. The ones place is the boss. 37 rounds up to 40. Final question for our homework this week. 818 rounded to the nearest hundred. Underline the hundreds place, circle the tens place. The tens place is the boss. That 1 tells me to roll back to 800. That brings us to the end of our homework assignment for this week. Please bring any questions you have with you to class or send a message. Have a great weekend.